Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Phil Arno. Often here on The Big Picture, I talk about my experiences when I was out in Los Angeles for 20 years. While I was out there, I spent quite a lot of time writing scripts and hanging on to the excitement of the Hollywood entertainment industry. One of the first things that you learn when you want to be a writer is that if you want to keep the interest of your audience, you have to offer conflict. Every story, every entertaining situation revolves around conflict. A good guy, or a bad guy. Of course, you're always supposed to root for that good guy, right? Well, normally that rule is supposed to apply to fiction. Journalism, in contrast, is supposed to play by a different set of rules. The media is not supposed to be there to entertain you, but to inform you. They're supposed to be able to leave their bias at home. Maybe they include the drama, but they're not supposed to pick the good guys and the bad guys. That's for you to decide. They're supposed to just tell you what's happening, plain and simple. And you, the informed public, can be the judge. You can decide what makes sense and what doesn't. Well, as most of us kind of know, it seems that today's so-called news media has, in effect, to command your attention and achieve an agenda, change the rules of the game. Just look at MSNBC and CNN. In print, look at the New York Times and the Washington Post. These so-called news outlets have become so biased in their coverage that it's downright laughable. The examples are constant and nothing new. One example, during the 2016 campaign for president, there was a big story about several women coming forward to accuse Trump of sexual assault. At the very same time, a story surfaced about a WikiLeaks release of Clinton campaign manager John Podesta's emails. They contained slurs and derogatory comments by senior Clinton campaign officials about Catholics, Latinos, and blacks, and outright confirmation of media collusion with the Clinton campaign. Now, the coverage. The night these stories broke, ABC, NBC, and CBS ran a combined 23 minutes of coverage of the Trump story. The Clinton story, 1 minute and 7 seconds. A ratio of negative coverage of Trump versus Clinton, 23-1. In print, it was no better. The New York Times had 11 negative stories on Trump, including one in the sports section, but 0 on the Clinton WikiLeaks story, 11-0. In Trump's first 100 days in office, CNN and NBC ran 93 negative stories out of every 100 stories for Trump. 93% negative. CBS was better, 91% negative. The New York Times was great, only 83% negatives. Now, you might say, well, what about Fox News? Right, they are the exception. But many of the personalities on Fox openly explain that they're commentators, not journalists, they're opinion people. For the record, Fox coverage during that first 100 days, 52% negative on Trump, 48% positive. Fair and balanced? Maybe. Here with me today is a man who is no stranger to the news media of today and the way things get covered. Congressman Chris Collins has served Western New York in public office for over 12 years, first as Erie County Executive, and now as our representative for the 27th Congressional District. Welcome to the show, Chris. It's a pleasure to have you here, and there's a lot to talk about. Let's first handle something that came out a little bit recently, and that's Chris Jacobs announcing that he'll be running for the same seat.
Well, first of all, and this will lead into your intro.
Right, okay.
What we will refer to as the fake news.
Right.
And since we're in the Buffalo market, the leader of the pack in fake news is the Buffalo News. And so it was amazing that when I ran last year, I didn't run against Nate McMurray. I ran against the Buffalo News. And probably the worst of the worst is a fellow named Jerry Zaremski. Jerry Zaremski pretends to be a reporter, but he's a columnist, in fact. And every story he writes, even one last week, two last week, I mean, again and again. My stories are on the front page, and the bias is just pouring forth. You know, twisted, just enough truth in it that he can say some things. But that is the media today. So let's talk about Chris Jacobs, who just jumped in. You have to know the Jacobs family, and Chris Jacobs would be a favorite of the Buffalo News. Very, very liberal editorials we see. And in fact, Chris Jacobs is a Democrat wearing a Republican sport coat. So just recently, they did a story called PolitiFact, where I have accurately referred to Chris Jacobs as a never-Trumper. Now, what is a never-Trumper? A never-Trumper doesn't mean that person has condemned Trump. It doesn't mean a never-Trumper is calling for his impeachment, like Nate McMurray is. But a never-Trumper is someone who's never supported Trump, and that is Chris Jacobs. So PolitiFact decided they would define a never-Trumper as someone who's calling for Trump's impeachment and called him out during the 2016 election cycle. So interestingly, they decided to have a definition, a Webster's definition, which is not accurate, and then wrote a story about it that said my claims that Jacobs was a never-Trumper were plain out false. So let's look at the facts. Donald Trump ran in 2016. Chris Jacobs never said a positive thing about Trump. We had a big rally here in Western New York at the KeyBank Center. Chris Jacobs was not there. We then had the Republican convention close by in Cleveland, where I seconded Donald Trump's nomination to be president of the United States.
And you were the first one actually to come out and endorse
And I was the first member of Congress. Chris Jacobs was not at the convention. Chris Jacobs had said at the time, I'm running for state senate, I'm not going to get involved in presidential debates. But he's pretending to be a Republican, again, Democrat really, wearing a Republican sport coat. But you know what was interesting? Bill Weld, who ran against Trump on the libertarian line, Chris Jacobs praised him several times. So he's saying he didn't want to enter the presidential, but he praised Bill Weld. And why did he do that? Because he was Bill Weld's lieutenant governor candidate when Bill Weld was looking to run for governor of New York. Ultimately, John Faso got the nod. So Chris Jacobs is too cute by half, trying to pretend now that he's not anti-Trump. Well, let's just call it out for what it is. He's certainly not pro-Trump. He's been a never-Trumper, never yet has said a positive thing about Trump. And so I contrast that every day. First, I'm the first member of Congress to support Donald Trump. I was chosen to second his nomination at the convention. And it was interesting, someone did a story recently on the voting record of members of Congress. It turns out of 435 members of Congress, I have the #1 voting record in support of the president. And it was just last week that the Buffalo News, I'm not sure what point they were trying to make, but they said on the potential threat of tariffs on Mexico if they didn't help stem the flow of Central Americans, flooding across the caravans, that he would impose tariffs. And they did point out I was the only member locally to support the president. And guess what? He got it done. He got it done. So in a way, I said they were trying to bash me in the Buffalo News. But in fact, they did me a favor. They reminded everyone that I've been with Trump since February of 16. That's 3.5 years. #1 voting record, have been with him because there's no president who has accomplished more for this country. The lowest unemployment in history, the highest employment among blacks in history, the highest employment for Hispanics. We have the high, the stock market. And I can go, and in many of these cases, I've been standing at the president's side as we've accomplished things.
There seems to be
the tax reform.
Yeah, there seems to be a very big contrast to what's happened in the last 2 years to what went on before.
Well, the irony of ironies is Joe Biden's trying to say President Obama set the stage for the great economy. He's admitting we have a great economy, And in some convoluted way, because under 8 years of Obama, the economy was awful, unemployment was high, the number of people on food stamps was at a high point. Now, 5 million people are no longer on food stamps because they're working. So again, it's not being reported accurately, which goes back to your
this is all
opening
related
statement.
because the message, whether it's coming from a politician or from the news media, it's something that gets twisted. In the example that you just gave, they're trying to take credit for the 8 years that Obama was in office. Now, I lived through those 8 years,
yeah, we all did.
And we all heard Obama personally get up there with a microphone and say, jobs are not going to come back. The manufacturing jobs are gone. We can't expect that to happen. And he said, I don't know how Trump is going to, he's promising to bring this back and to raise the economy and the GDP, that's what kind of magic wand is he going to have to fix all those things? He's just not going to do it. And you can Google that, you can get it on YouTube. He actually said those things.
We got the economy growing again. We started the longest streak of job creation on record. We covered another 20 million people on health insurance. We brought housing back here in Nevada. We cut our deficits by more than half, partly by making sure the wealthiest Americans, folks like me, paid their fair share of taxes. So by the time I left office, wages were rising, uninsurance rate was falling, poverty was falling, and that's what I handed off to the next guy. So when you hear all this talk about economic miracles right now, remember who started it.
Because some of those jobs of the past are just not going to come back. And when somebody says, like the person you just mentioned, who I'm not going to advertise for, that he's going to bring all these jobs back. Well, how exactly are you going to do that? What are you going to do? There's no answer to it. He just says, well, I'm going to negotiate a better deal. Well, how exactly are you going to negotiate that? What magic wand do you have? And usually the answer is he doesn't have an answer. So what I've tried to do, what my administration's tried to do is, let's grow those manufacturing sectors like clean energy, like some of these new technologies that are coming up, and said, let's invest in this so that when the new jobs come, they're coming here. But I got to tell you that the days when you just being willing to work hard, and you can now walk into a plant and suddenly there's going to be a job for you for 30 years or 40 years, that's just not going to be there for our kids.